Hi Diego, howdy YouTube.
Put on my glasses and get started. Okay, this is the fourth class. I had some announcements, but somehow I didn't get an outline. Just borrow yours. Okay, one of the things is that we finally heard from Michael Estera. His site has been down, his soil minerals site. And it turns out he was in a bike accident and bunged up and then got a viral infection, and he was pretty much out of commission, but also his site is still down and he's working on it. I don't know why, but hopefully it'll come back up. Our email site as of yesterday is also crippled. We can send out but not receive, and I think it's being held for ransom, so we got to get that straightened out. I talked earlier about people getting the text of the lectures that they might have missed or come in late on, and if they've paid for them, we'll furnish those. If they just plain missed it, the text of that particular class, there'll be a $10 charge. And what we're headed for is, after our workshop, all of you who've been attending and attended all the classes or had really good excuses can get into the last workshop next week without pay, okay? No charge for that. And then there'll be the certificates handed out to those who've gone all the way through the course next week. And those who have missed a class can make it up if they furnish me a one-page report on what they learned from the lecture. All right, so we can be sure that they got it all. I was going to be handing out a bunch of miscellaneous handouts, but unfortunately, I guess I left at the house. There is this one for the propagation log that Iris produced, and if you didn't get that and you want it, it's laying right here. Anything else you want, I was going to make a sign-up sheet. Put down your name, your phone number, and what it is you missed, whether it was a gardening leaflet or a class lecture or whatever. We'll try and get all of that together for you for next week so that you're not missing anything. And then I've already gone over the thing about the errors I made with regard to the worm bin. And I don't know that there's anything more to announce or go over since...
So I apparently missed that.
Oh, on the worm bin thing?
Yeah.
Well, I was asked by Don, you know, what's on the bottom of the bin? And I told him it was the fabric that was underneath it, but actually it wasn't, because we had slit that open and opened it up. And so it was open to the ground. And then he said, what do you put in there? Well, I wasn't thinking. You're supposed to put slats of boards across it with a gap in between them, but close enough together that a mole can't get up through the bottom. Okay, and also that serves for when you're digging down to the bottom, you know where the bottom is when you're harvesting. You could also put hardware cloth underneath the boards, or just use it underneath as a means of keeping moles out and letting you know where the ground starts. That was pretty much it. Alright. Here we go. Superior soil making. In the advanced gardening course outline, we said that our objective for this class is to create super soil, or superior soil, based on knowing all the factors and providing all the needed materials and conditions of aeration, drainage, wetness, and fertility. Your particular garden site may already have excellent workable soil, not needing much in the way of improvement. With the professional soil test, you can find out where it stands in terms of deficiencies and excesses of nutrients, and the basic soil parameters of pH, organic matter content, and cation exchange capacity. And then you simply apply the needed fertilizing materials at the recommended rate and work them into the upper 6 to 8 inches. However, we're going to assume that your garden site needs more than adding some fertilizers and perhaps some organic matter, or that your site may be in bad shape and have poor conditions, such as being rocky, excessively sandy, clayey, or poor draining, and maybe you want to go to gardening in containers, and you want to know what's the best formula for creating your own high-performing and fertile potting mix. These are the challenges today's class is intended to address. In addition, in our fifth and final class, we'll have a practical session, workshop, where you can see these media being made. When faced with a difficult or problem site, one of my slogans is to rise above it, which is to say, go to raised beds, either by creating a box frame and bringing in a prepared garden soil mix, or maybe the separate ingredients to mix yourself, or by simply mounding up such a soil mix, or bringing together whatever materials are at hand. But if you're going to make a quality potting or container mix, likely you're going to have to bring in some specific materials and fertilizer ingredients and follow a fairly precise recipe. John, has TJ come in?
I don't know, I was outside.
I had his bill right up here. Anyway. So in any case, what we're seeking to create is superior soil for either the open garden site, the raised bed, or the movable container. Here's the question. If we're setting out to create the perfect garden or potting soil, what would it look and feel like, and what would be its qualities or characteristics? Here's my answer. For a garden soil, we're striving for a one-type-fits-all universal growing media to keep gardening simple yet highly productive. With a container mix, we have to develop a very different media, yet we're shooting for a standardized media that can grow just about any plant or crop you would want to grow outdoors in this climate. That would include actual soil as well as one of its desired ingredients. We can also make a soilless media suitable for indoor growing of many kinds of indoor and more exotic plants, but likely not for all of them. Indoor plants range over a much wider spectrum of growing conditions and requirements. So ideally, any of these media would be free of weed seeds, or at least easy to weed and easy to work. It would have a nice cake crumb structure and a nice feel, or I think that's called friable. Be well aerated for the easy exchange of oxygen going in and carbon dioxide coming out. It would drain well, yet retain adequate moisture so you aren't having to constantly water it. For the garden site, you would have 5 to 10% organic matter by volume, but considerably higher organic matter of necessity for container media. At least some of that organic matter needs to contain life or be biologically active, which can come from worm castings, compost, or well-aged manure, but not from peat moss. In the case of what we do and make here, that is here, mineralized worm castings are the key to providing exquisite biological activity. Lastly, your garden or container media needs to have all the necessary nutrient minerals in the right amounts, ratios, and balance, or the ABCs of fertility, which, if you remember, you have to have the adequate amount, you have to have it in balance, all right, and you have to have the complete array of the nutrients if you're trying to reach ideal or perfect soil. These media start off with soil-applied granular fertilizers as the main meal, something like our bloom fertilizer mix, or whatever the soil prescription calls for. You mix that up and work it in. To be followed with liquid fertilizers such as liquid fish and kelp, or both, applied to the soil, or foliar sprayed for snacks and tonics as you proceed through the growing season, or more exactly the seasons. From the standpoint of food crops, what we're after is the perfect soil that results in perfect health and perfectly nutritious or nutrient-dense fruits and vegetables, or, for that matter, the perfect chicken's eggs, cow's milk, or healthy hamburgers. And it all starts with the soil. It's quality in, quality out. So what's in a perfect garden or potting soil, and how do we make it? That's partly in an experimental stage, and we at Black Lake Organic are pursuing and researching the goal of a perfect soil, and we will be using growing trials this year with pepper plants. And by the way, the pepper plants are up, and we may have somebody bring them here and let you see them. It's always nice to see little babies. So remind me to do that. So we're going to be using pepper plants to test our results, and you may want to do the same thing by providing an untreated area in your garden where you can compare plants or crops side by side to see the difference that proper conditioning and fertilizing makes. Prepare to be astounded. Remember too that if you want to take a shortcut and a shotgun approach to fertility, it won't be perfect, but you can always go with a complete organic fertilizer mix such as one of our bloom blends. Toward the end of my lecture in the last class, I talked about container media and growing requirements included in that discussion of the kinds of pots and their exposure to light and heat. I discussed the characteristics of some of the ingredient materials that go into the base media mix. In that connection, I had written a little article that I want to read to you. It's titled, "The Evolution of Potting Mixes, a Bedtime Story." So, when I was a kid of say 10, about 1950, there was no such thing as a soilless potting mix. All potting mixes contain soil, otherwise known as dirt. Old-fashioned or classical potting mixes almost always consisted of 3 ingredients, 2 of which were soil and sand, and the 3rd ingredient was some form of organic matter, which might have been compost, manure, leaf mold, or peat moss. To this might have been added 1 or more organic fertilizers such as bone meal, hoof and horn meal, maybe blood meal, and possibly some rock minerals such as rock phosphate, granite meal, green sand, and maybe some lime. But back in the 1950s, nursery owners began having trouble obtaining topsoil. They saw it as being too heavy to haul and ship, and besides, it contained germs. Heavens, germs. To tackle this dirt problem, the University of California began searching for and experimenting with a potting media alternative that did away with dirt, was lightweight, germless, and yet had suitable characteristics of drainage and water retention, and could grow satisfactory nursery plants or pots. What they came up with was known as the UC mix, which spread throughout the nursery trade in one or another version. Part of this was an outgrowth of the phobia for germs, and so it went to the extent of almost like going into nuclear, exploding nuclear plants, right? You have to wear a suit and special boots, and you have to step in a sterilizing liquid and go through the door and close the door real quick so none of them germs get in there. And that's the kind of mentality that got set up with the germ phobia, and it's based on the hypothesis that disease is a matter of some alien thing that's waiting to attack. And so there's another alternative theory on that. The base media ingredients of the UC mix are peat moss and sand. Meanwhile, on the other coast at Cornell University in New York, the Cornell peatlite mix was developed, consisting of peat moss and vermiculite or perlite. And as I mentioned before, those are actually have very different properties, so they're not really interchangeable. The latter ingredient acted like sand to provide airspace. The thing about these nearly sterile soilless media mixes is that they were infertile, and thus fertilizers had to be added, and these were to be mainly soluble chemical or unnatural materials, or else chemical plus natural materials, and usually lime or dolomite. A rundown of some of the chemicals is potassium nitrate, superphosphate, and fritted trace elements. Natural materials might include dolomite, calcium carbonate, which is regular agricultural lime, gypsum, potassium sulfate, and iron sulfate. Often times these, however, are industrially created products. So I need to back up. Over in England, possibly long before the 1940s, a fellow named John Innes, a nurseryman, developed what became famous over there as the John Innes mix, which was referred to as a potting compost, even though it was not a compost. The ingredients of that mix consisted of composted loam, whatever that is, probably just aged lawn sod, peat moss, and coarse sand with added hoof and horn meal for nitrogen, superphosphate for phosphorus, sulfate of potash for potassium plus sulfur, and calcium carbonate or lime, which they refer to as chalk. And I think that's what chalk is. The only non-natural material is the superphosphate, but there you can see the classic soil, sand, and peat moss mixture as the base media ingredients. Let me emphasize that this mix called for coarse sand, not fine sand. Presumably the John Innes mix works quite well. Size matters in containers. If you had a container the size of a house filled with straight soil, it would perform just as well as a garden plot to grow a plant. If, however, you try to grow a plant in a 1-gallon pot using just straight soil, it will usually grow quite poorly because of the constraints imposed by the container walls and bottom in relation to the amount of volume of soil that's in it. The soil in a small container after a few waterings will become compacted, air will be squeezed out, and water will tend to run to the sides and drain along the space next to the wall and out the bottom, or possibly settle in the bottom and waterlog the soil. Plant roots have to have air and water. They also have to have nutrients. The smaller the pot, the more difficult it is to provide the necessary characteristics. Okay, that's the neighbor. The smaller the pot, the more difficult it is to provide the necessary characteristics of aeration, drainage, and the right degree of moisture retention, and also the looseness of texture that permits easy root penetration. When you get up to about the container size of a half whiskey barrel, provided it has enough drainage holes, these characteristics or physical properties become less problematic, and a straight loam type soil that contains some natural nutrients, including minerals, may perform just fine for ordinary plants. The thing about dirt in a soil-based media is that it generally provides nutrients, it generally contains friendly microbes, which help out in feeding plants and in the right environment with good fertility. It assists in creating and maintaining the optimal soil conditions for aeration, drainage, and water retention. Organic matter provides retention, sand provides drainage, and soil is Mr. In-Between. Microbes and earthworms provide biological activity. Some would say that soil is alive. Good soil certainly contains an amazing diversity and amount of living organisms which operate in synergy with inorganic components and plant roots to co-evolve soil and provide the best of conditions for plant or crop growth. Even so, in some natural situations, such as our overly wet climate that washes or leaches out minerals, the addition of mineral fertilizers and good organic matter is necessary to attain the more nearly ideal soil environment to grow crops of high nutritional quality of the sort our bodies require for optimal health. End of story. Well, right after our class last week, a lady came in and bought 50 pounds of our all-vegetable bloom mix and 2 bags of lime, or 100 pounds, on my advice. I had talked with her earlier about her situation. She has a garden space of about 1,000 square feet. trying to visualize that. That could be 10 times 100, 20 times, or, yeah, 20 times 50, or roughly 33 by 33. It started out as sand, her garden, that gave her poor results. She heard about someone who had free clay, so she got some and actually applied about 2 feet of it over her sandy bed. I told her the best thing would have been to till the clay into the sand, but now it was too late to do that, and she had to deal with loosening the clay to make it usable. There are 3 things you can add to clay soil to loosen it and turn it into a workable medium and potentially a very fertile garden soil. Remember, it has this, usually has this high cation exchange capacity, which is a measure of potential to hold fertility. You could add coarse sand, but this generally is not practical because it takes such a huge amount to make a difference. The second thing is organic matter, so I advise her to get and apply an inch of aged manure and till it in. She said she has lots of leaves for organic matter, so I said, okay, use that. The third thing that is effective in loosening clay is agricultural or calcitic lime at least 100 pounds per 1,000 square feet. Remember, calcium loosens soil, magnesium tightens it. So you don't want to use high magnesium dolomite with clay. Incidentally, someone asked me last week to discuss the different limes, and I only got partway into that, so ask me again. Actually, I'll just go into that now. There's several different kinds of limes, and it's very confusing. Some people think of lime as being simply calcium. Probably more technically, calcium oxide, so just calcium and oxygen constitutes lime, but there's all kinds of variations over that. And I've forgotten whether that is called slaked lime or something else. But anyway, the next lime is hydrated lime, and that's calcium hydroxide. So we're adding some hydrogen here to the calcium and the oxygen. Calcium hydroxide is a man-made lime, and it's made by burning, in some sense, calcium carbonate to drive off the carbon and replace it with the hydroxide radical. So calcium hydroxide, it's somewhat caustic. However, if you take it out and spread it out on the ground exposed to the air, it will pull carbon dioxide back out of the air and mix it in and convert the calcium hydroxide back to calcium carbonate. So it is used to accelerate pH change in a soil, but it's not acceptable in organic gardening. So you have slaked lime. I've forgotten the name for the other one, and one of those two is slaked lime or burned lime. Part of the reason that came about was that in the olden days they didn't have the machinery to be able to grind limes and rocks to the fineness that they would like to have. So with lime, they burned it so that it would make the calcium more quickly available when they put it on the soil. But that isn't necessary anymore because you can buy it in a very fine powdery form. Even so, with calcium carbonate, it's rather slow to act. That's the one that's acceptable in organic growing, as is dolomite. And I discussed dolomite as being a high magnesium lime. You may well need some percentage of dolomite as well to get some magnesium into your garden, but both of those are relatively slow releasing. If you're trying to get calcium into the soil real quickly, I think that gypsum, which is probably technically not a lime, would work a lot faster. That's calcium sulfate or calcium sulfate hydrate or something like that. And I understand it's about 25 times quicker releasing the calcium. But when it does that, you also get the sulfur. And if you don't need or want the sulfur, you don't want the calcium, the gypsum. But you may well. And I'm not clear about what actually would be the better one to use for loosening up clay in this climate.
Is
Yeah.
clay, does clay just always have magnesium in it, or is it something different than just having magnesium?
I guess the question would be, would it have appreciable magnesium in it? It partly depends on the kind of clay and how old it is geologically and what's the climate, right? So some clays are very poor at retaining minerals. Some of them may be naturally rich because there's been a source of, let's say, magnesium and calcium and so forth in the area that's been brought to the clay or was right there as the clay was being formed over the eons. And so those things might be in there or at least attached to the clay. However, over time in the heavy rainfall areas, that clay is likely to be leached out to the point that the minerals have been replaced by the hydrogen ions. So then the clay is very acid, it's very lacking in minerals, and the solution is to get the minerals in there to bump the hydrogen off, so that the hydrogen combines with oxygen, becomes water, and the clay takes up the magnesium, the calcium, the potassium, ammonium, other cations, it takes them up. So there's not a yes-no answer to your question. It depends on the conditions. So if you're in a situation where the clay soil is just naturally infertile, or it's been made that way as a result of abuse and overuse, and the nutrients have been sucked out of it and extracted, then you got to put them back. And the way you know where you stand and how much to put back of which ones is the professional soil test. I hope I've covered the lime thing.
Was there a particular mineral that caused the hydrogen to mix with the oxygen and become water?
Well, it gets bumped off, and it has a charge. It has a positive charge, and so the oxygen has a negative charge, and so it combines at one oxygen to two hydrogen and turns into water.
So is it when you add the calcium to that it causes that reaction?
The calcium knocks the hydrogen off, and then with any luck the clay picks up and clings to, or has the calcium cling to it. And there was a thought there. Essentially, low pH, which is high acidity, is a condition of infertility. And oftentimes that infertility is largely due to an insufficiency of calcium in the soil, or calcium being applied in the form of lime, for instance. And so Dr. Albrecht referred to calcium as the king of the nutrients. And it is needed in much greater quantity than was realized, and particularly for the soil and the mechanics or the operations of the soil and the needs of the microbes that are going to work on the soil physical texture and loosen it, make it more aerated, make it capable of taking up water but also draining off excess water. So calcium is very critical to that, and I think we talked earlier about calcium being a trucker that takes nutrients into the plant and dumps them and comes back out. And I'm not sure whether that's at the root level or at the cell level or both. So oftentimes, and particularly in this climate, the key to making things work is liming. And you can, however, overdo liming. So you don't want to push it past the neutral range. Ideally you want it in a 6.5 pH probably, because you want a little bit of acidity left there, and that gets used in knocking the nutrients off of the clay for the plants to pick up either out of the soil solution or just right directly off of the clay into the root. The calcium and the other nutrients, which is potassium, what have you. And then we want to get them, as far as the main 4 cations, we want to get them in that ideal ratio if we can, of approximately 65% calcium, 15% magnesium, 4% sodium, 1%, 4% potassium, 1% sodium. That's just roughly. And then you want to get about 5% or so of the trace element cations, and have some left over for the hydrogen cation. The hydrogen cation is a very active ion, and not in that form in the soil is not a nutrient. The other cations are, but the hydrogen is not, and it makes for acidity. And so you want to get it out of there and replace it with the minerals. And that governs and dictates fertility overall in the soil. So that's what you attack first. You find out what the soil needs. Likely it's calcium. You add enough without overdoing it. And you may want to add the other things, or come back later and add the other things according to which is most in deficiency. You're trying to make that up first. All right. Okay, so we talked about this lady who had put 2 feet of clay over her sand, and I mentioned that the third thing that is effective in loosening clay is agricultural or calcitic lime at least 100 pounds per 1,000 square feet. So you never want to work a wet, particularly clayey soil. It'll turn into hard as rock clods. She will need to wait until the ground dries out some, then apply the lime and the leaves until those end, and then apply the organic fertilizer mix until it ends. Remember that the clay typically has a high cation exchange capacity and will attract the lime's calcium, plus the calcium, magnesium, potassium, and sodium and other cations in the fertilizer mix, and hold on to them to retard their leaching out due to our copious rainfall. Once the leaves that you've worked in have rotted to become humus, it attains a high cation exchange capacity as well, and does the same thing. Plus its humic acids and carbonic acids can help free up other minerals that are present in the fertilizer. And we could think of this as both curing a common problem and creating or building a superior soil. Now then, had the lady not added the clay, she could have improved her sandy soil by tilling in leaves to help retain moisture, and by applying dolomite with magnesium to somewhat tighten the soil, although it would never achieve the high nutrient retention or fertility level that the clay with organic matter or humus potentially could reach. And I should add, though, that there are some clay types that have a low cation exchange capacity. Their structure is such that they simply don't have the electromagnetic charge. So, wish her luck. So let's look at soil building for an orchard. One option for fruit trees is to do the fertile mulching system. And I gave out the BLO leaflet on that method in the last class. And that's an example. If you didn't get that, let us know, preferably in writing, and we can make it available in the future. Another option to that method would be to use Barrett's method of building a donut ring around the tree under the drip line, using the feedstock layering that we're employing in our worm bins, but without the bins, of course, and releasing worm eggs and casings or domesticated bin worms into the food stock pile. You could spread our bloom number 7 tree and shrub fertilizer mix on the ground and stack the feedstock layers extra high with the aim of including an extra high population, or inducing an extra high population of redworms, or attracting high numbers of night crawlers that will work on the feedstock and also carry it along with the fertilizer down into the soil to feed tree roots while also aerating the root zone with their tunneling. The trees will experience robust growth and greater production. This reminds me of an experience, or the experience, of my associate and customer Ron Lawson, who has a quince tree that was exhibiting some kind of disease or abnormal growth of its leaves, and he asked me what he could do about it. It was producing lemon-sized quinces. I recommended he do the fertile mulching, which he did. The next year he was back and thrilled that his tree's foliage was healthy and vibrant, and his quince fruits were now grapefruit sized. To get big fruit, the leaves have to be healthy, fully extended, and operating at peak photosynthetic efficiency and getting their minerals. Probably everyone is familiar with the double digging method popularized by John Jeevons down in California for intensive vegetable gardening. This method involves removing the top spades depth of soil in order to loosen the next spades depth layer, or perhaps subsoil, and replacing the top layer. This is a lot of work that may be unnecessary. A couple of things can be said for Jeevons' method, however. One is that he works a lot of organic fertilizers into the bottom layer. Secondly, when he shifts the top layer over into the adjacent trench, he makes an effort not to disturb its profile so that the microbes and the aerated layer stays in place. However, by feeding the topsoil, mulching it, and inoculating it with earthworms or attracting them, you can get them to burrow and loosen the subsoil for you. And Barrett reports that earthworms, given nourishment, are known to break up extremely compacted hard pans. This, however, is more likely true of the night crawler and the regular garden worm than of the red wiggler or manure worm. So let us suppose that you just bought a nice piece of property and a house in Olympia. The lot has enough room for a vegetable garden, but the topsoil has been scraped off and sold, and what's left is excessively rocky and impossible to dig in or work with. But you're determined to have a garden, and you want the best possible soil or growing media for quality, nutritious crops. So what do you do to get that? Most people would get on the phone after their fingers had done the walking and order a dump truck load of garden soil mix from Great Western because that's what's available. That mix consists of 1/3 topsoil and 2/3 mushroom compost. It sells for about $27 a yard delivered. Some people are quite happy with it. I can tell you though, I've heard lots of people complain or curse it. Additionally, I'm quite sure it contains chemical fungicides associated with the mushroom compost, and the mushroom compost appears to be the reason for a number of undesirable nutrient imbalances that stunt or derange plant growth. You may recall me talking about that, and I think it was the last lecture, and the lady who had the Great Western garden mix, and her plants were stunted and turning purple. And I told her to take it out and bring in our mix, and then she gave us that testimonial for how well that worked. Okay, in May of 2009, I had a sample of the Great Western Garden Soil Mix tested. That was her sample, and evaluated by Michael Estera. Here's what Michael said about the lab report findings. The CEC number at 36.48 was unusually high, and he did not trust the lab figure. The pH at 7.8 was very alkaline and not good. Organic matter content at 7.5% was okay. Sulfur at 6,171 parts per million was hugely excessive and should be instead about 210 parts per million. Phosphorus was okay, sodium okay, iron, manganese, and copper were good, there was too much calcium and a huge excess of potassium, 3 times the ideal level, while magnesium was a little low. On a per 1,000 square foot basis, 16 ounces of boron and 10 ounces of zinc sulfate were needed. In his notes section, Michael commented, "As with every other Great Western topsoil mix I have seen, calcium, potassium, and sulfur are way too high, while magnesium is too low. There is 30 times too much sulfur. This is the same mix and the same problem that was killing the landscape plants in front of the San Francisco Street Bakery in 2007. My recommendation would be to not use this soil at all." So if you had this soil test information, would you buy the Great Western Garden Soil Mix? I think not. And I'll point out that Great Western sells 2 other mixes you might find suitable. However, neither of these comes with an added organic or natural fertilizers or instructions on what to add to them to balance and raise their fertility for achieving outstanding plant or crop growth. You're on your own there. One of these mixes, the native mix, contains 1/2 topsoil, 1/4 manure, and 1/4 dark bark. So it's half minerals and half organic matter. The other mix, the Washington blend, is 50% dark bark or well-rotted bark, 30% manure, 10% washed sand, probably fine-grained sand, because that's what I saw out there, and 10% pumice. So the pumice would have been larger, let's call it grain size, perhaps to make up for the fact that the sand was too fine. The latter mix, the Washington blend, is selling at about $37 a yard delivered. Any needed fertilization would be an added cost, but how would you know what to apply and how much? There is another locally available garden mix made with washed cow manure, at least I believe it's washed, in wood shavings litter, fine sand, and local peat moss. No fertilizer is added. I've had some people tell me they liked it, and others tell me they had trouble with it caking up, and I don't know what they got in terms of quality growth or production. That mix sells for $30 a yard at the plant. It uses no topsoil and I think has other undesirable properties that could be improved upon. For one thing, as a potting mix, it retains too much water, at least when combined with 25% topsoil, which is what we did, and needs to be cut with perlite or pumice to correct the drainage, particularly if you're using it as a potting mix. You'll notice that all these garden type mixes, that with all of these mixes, the proportion of organic matter to mineral and inorganic matter is very high and much higher than the 5 to 10% soil scientists say is adequate or ideal. Over time, the organic matter will diminish, but the mineral matter does not diminish, unless it's washed away or taken up by plants. It was mainly because of these negatives I saw with the main garden soil mixes available locally that I set out to develop and market a superior garden mix, to which, and that is what I presently am having made this year, which might be termed a 4-way garden soil mix, to which a specified amount of balanced and complete organic fertilizer is to be applied by the customer, subsequent to delivery and spreading of the mix on site. So what is the BLO Superior Garden Soil Mix that I'm recommending and divulging for you to make yourself or purchase? Well, I look at garden and potting mixes as composed of 2 parts. One is the base media and 2, the fertilizer package. In the case of the garden soil base mix, there are 4 components, which are soil, sand, peat, and compost. Each of these components has its own preferred properties. To be perfect, the soil would be a weed-free loam, the sand would be coarse and just under BB size. Pumice or perlite might substitute for sand, but would be expensive. The peat would be local, but could be Canadian or coconut husk, coir it's called. This year I'm planning to use dark bark as a peat substitute and experiment with its properties. We have some of it out there, and this one that I've come across is in a little container here that I can pass around. This is going to be my substitute for peat moss, which causes some problems. And I'm hoping that this is coming from commodities out near the airport. They have what they're calling the dark bark, and this one, which is like half dark or something. You'd have to go out and point to it if you want to get exactly what you're looking for, because you're likely to wind up with the wrong thing, which we did. We had to take it back and get the right one. All right, find out where I was. Well, it gets down to a definition of what does composted mean. Okay.
Aged.
Yeah, rotted, I would certainly agree. On its way to becoming humus, yes, but not probably very much of it is humus yet. Not all of compost, even when properly made, becomes humus. I contend that proper compost has to be a combination of ingredients, not simply one thing, or even manure. Even though manure may have a combination of things in it, depending on what the animal is fed, and then the dung part of it mixed with some kind of a litter, and I would say that minimally qualifies as a compost. You know, if you mix it, heat it up, and ideally keep it out of the rain and so forth. But my definition of compost goes beyond that. So, is it rotted down? Yes, it's definitely rotted down. And we talked about at one point the mystery of how plant matter will go from being green to being almost black in the process of decomposing. And at the same time, when it's still green, it has this low cation exchange capacity or electromagnetic quality. And over time, it acquires a very high cation exchange capacity, even higher than clay, considerably higher than clay. How does that happen? I'm not sure. I'll have to dig into that. I don't know that we know the answer. What makes it turn black? Okay. I think I was down near the bottom of this page. Okay. This year I'm planning to use dark bark as a peat substitute and experiment with its properties. The fourth ingredient, compost, would ideally be a quality product free of plastic scraps and other junk, possibly homemade or some substitute, perhaps aged manure, and to make a premier product, some portion of high quality worm castings. All of this is to be in equal quantities, although we hope to experiment with these proportions and test them in our planned grow trials using the peppers. You'll notice that this four-way mix is half mineral material and half organic matter, but we are suggesting or adding a complete fertilizer to it. Next comes the fertilizing package. One option for this is to send off a sample of the base mix for soil testing, which I've done, and develop a precise mineral mix according to test parameter results or advised prescriptions. To that may be added a nitrogen jump starter material, such as an animal meal, that should not be needed again once the desired biological activity and synergy gets underway. So one of the problems with sending in a potting mix is that it isn't a soil. And so the lab tests soils, and they may have a separate procedure for testing potting mixes. And I went around and around this merry-go-round trying to find out what was the best procedure to use, and came back to where I started, and we just did the regular soil test on it. So I'm not sure that because it is not a soil, and because it is almost entirely organic matter, or in our case, at least 50% organic matter, that we're getting the right readings when we send it in for a soil test. So a second and satisfactory option to the fertilization aspect is to use an educated guess based on what we know and suspect about the base mix ingredients, and then selecting a complete and mineralized balanced fertilizer, possibly with lime where needed. And my suspicion is that this four-way mix, not containing any mushroom compost, is going to be acidic and lacking in calcium and magnesium. Thus, I think our bloom number 2, which contains lime, is going to be the appropriate pre-blended complete fertilizer containing lime. All of the bloom blends also contain biosome archaeobacteria and microapplied mycorrhizal fungi to ensure biological activity. And of course, they are all mineral augmented and have animal and or plant meals in them. So there will be a source of nitrogen and phosphorus and other things coming out of those plant and animal meals. Theoretically not necessary if everything else gets in there in the right proportions. Now then, supposing you wanted to go even further in your quest for an ideal nutrient-rich and biologically enriched super soil. To the four-way mix, if you're purchasing something pre-selected and blended, you might add bat and bird guanos for potent, quick-release action and some high-quality mineralized and pre-digested worm castings. We're making a soilless mix that does use bird and bat guanos in it, so that has no dirt in it, and it uses as a base media a pre-made material called Sunshine number 2, and I'm not planning to go into that any further. Such ingredients, except the guanos, are contained in the soil-based superior potting mix that VLO is making to sell, and this can be added at a certain percentage to the four-way mix to create a gourmet garden soil blend, which we're recommending for an ultimate raised bed medium. This superior potting mix is to be added at a 10% rate of the whole base mix, but only put into the top 8 inches to do the most good and conserve on cost. That way also the concentrated richness and biological activity is there for seedlings early in the year to get off to a jump start. Beyond doing all of this, as the season goes along, you could supplement fertilize with liquid fish and liquid seaweeds poured on the soil, and with the same liquid fertilizers and possibly molasses and apple cider vinegar called for in our witch's brew used in the fertile mulching program, as both a soil drench and an occasional foliar spray booster tonic. So these extra steps are justified as the growing season advances and the first applied main fertilizer gets taken up and used up, at least partially, by early stage plant growth. Foliar sprays are especially helpful for getting trace elements directly and quickly into the plant and bypassing the delayed and sometimes hampered soil processing of fertilizers. Furthermore, foliar fertilization can be up to 7 times more efficient for trace mineral delivery. A tiny amount goes a long way. However, you'll still need the major ingredients of the main meal or soil drench fertilization to get all the needed nutrients to the plant, and for foliar spray supplementation to be effective. Sometimes it works miracles, or it can be a dud if the fertility is incomplete. So in other words, if you remember the barrel diagram, just applying the trace elements when the other things are inadequate isn't going to get you there to the complete full barrel, right? So you have to make sure that the calcium and let's say the potassium and so forth are there in sufficient quantity for the trace minerals to really top it off and complete the full meal deal. Now then, let's look at making a superior potting media. But first, let's look at some commercially made so-called potting soils. most of what is on the market does not contain any actual soil. This gets even more semantically maddening when dilettantes insist on calling these products dirt. Great Western offers a potting soil mix that consists of 1/2 fine bark, 1/4 small pumice, and 1/4 turf mix, which is itself 2/3 topsoil and 1/3 mushroom compost. So it contains considerable soil, but evidently no added fertilizer except what might come from the mushroom compost, and we saw that it is very much nutrient imbalanced, the mushroom compost. So let's take a look at a popular soilless potting mix, namely the Black Gold organic potting mix we sell at BLO. If you look at the listed ingredients, you'll see that they include peat moss, about 50%, compost of some kind, possibly just aged manure with litter, and worm castings, most likely from manure that might have been also fed something like ground up corn or vegetable scraps, and probably only partly actual castings or actual worm manure. And I know these things because I know the materials that have been supplied to Black Gold in the past as compost and castings. Okay? They'll probably accept anything that you want to call compost and castings because coming up with that stuff is very hard to do. Also included will be pumice and perlite, but no soil in the Black Gold. In some cases it says peanut hulls, rice hulls, and forest products, meaning wood and bark, and cinders of some sort may be included. Likely there is some bone meal and dolomite added, but they are no longer listed on the bag. People use this product and seem to find it satisfactory and come back for more. We did some grow trials that included Black Gold several years ago, amongst a half a dozen others, and it was one of the better performers. Black Gold may be one of the better soilless potting media available, but contains little fertility for the long haul. Can we improve upon the Great Western and the Black Gold potting mixes? Our limited trials indicate that we can. Also, over the years, BLO has raised and sold vegetable starts and other plants using our own custom soil-based media and received praise for the health and quality of our plants. I'll just inject here, nobody else does this. I don't think you can find anybody like at a nursery that actually puts soil in their potting mixes and runs the risk of germs, right? What we plan to make this year to sell and we plan to do experiments and grow trials on will be similar to what we've used over the years. Also, our strategy and mission is to continually work on perfecting our soil-based potting mix, as well as a soil-less version intended mainly for indoor plant growing. For our purposes today, I'm going to cover making of the soil-based mix. Recall that the base media of the four-way garden soil mix is soil, sand, peat, and compost in equal parts, but with substitutes or allowable variations of all the parts except the soil. The soil itself will vary because it is nearly impossible to get the same consistent supply of topsoil from time to time or batch to batch. And frequently, what you're being sold is actually subsoil. For the potting mix, I've settled on pumice of a certain size in place of coarse sand, which is difficult to find. In place of quality compost, which likewise is difficult to obtain or make in large quantity, I've decided to go with an aged horse manure in wood chips that is fully rotted down, and this source appears to have very little weed seeds. For worm feedstock, you want a semi-aged manure, but here we're not feeding worms, so we want a well-aged manure, and we want it for a source of nitrogen and other nutrients which should be present in the aged manure if it has not been stored out in the rain very long. On the peat moss component, I have a dilemma because I'd rather not use the Canadian packaged version that has comparatively poor wetting and water retention properties. There is just one local source of peat moss that has super moisture retention, but that has a hauling distance problem and arrives as a sloppy mess. Additionally, due to its high moisture retention, it has to have a lot of perlite or pumice mixed in to allow adequate drainage when used in containers. Consequently, I've decided to go with dark bark, and I've found a source that is not so rotted or as wet as that being used for our garden soil mix. We will have to monitor and assess its water holding and draining characteristics in the base mix. So, what I've wound up as a base mix for the potting media, and I don't like calling it soil, is sifted topsoil, medium pumice, aged horse manure, and semi-dark bark. To that will be added our superior mineralized worm castings and a complete organic fertilizer, also mineralized and containing calcitic lime. In addition, there will be the biozone bacteria and the microapplied fungi inoculants, but not absolutely necessary. This fertilizer mix can be a specific custom blend, but for your purposes could be our Bloom number 2 blend, which we call our Maritime Northwest blend, and which has the lime already in it. All of the Bloom blends contain over a dozen ingredients, including plant and animal meals and natural rock minerals, powders, and selected trace minerals calculated to supply those commonly deficient in our region's native soils. There you have it. In our 5th and final class in this series next week, we'll have a practical workshop session on the making of these mixes and the worm bin feedstock as we roll into production of all the soil products just in time for spring planting and for selling to the public here at Blackwood Organic, and eventually at other retail locations in the vicinity and beyond. We're having the garden mix made out on Old 99 at a place called NO Enterprises. We'll have some trucked in here, but we won't have loading capability for those that might want to come and get it. It's going to be a U-shovel proposition. And it's going to be selling at $40 a yard. So higher than all the rest of them, but we think superior to all of the rest of them. I thought what I would do is do a question discussion thing and then go into the last part of the class having to do with the maintenance aspects of gardening. In other words, weeding, watering, pest control, and harvest. I'm not actually going to say much about harvest. That's a long ways off. But I thought we'd take some questions here and have some discussion on what I've already given, and then talk about maintenance in gardening. Yes?
When you have that, you said that like peat moss will retain too much water, so you need to put the coarse sand in there. What effect does that have when it retains the water?
Well, it's been very mysterious. When it dries out, then it becomes the opposite. It becomes chunky, and you have to break it up and screen it. So we've done that, and that's in itself is labor intensive and not really what you're looking for. You can get that same peat moss dried out and probably very nice to work with, but the difference is between $15 for the wet stuff, the yard, to $100 for the dried stuff. That's the cost of burning up petroleum.
I was thinking more in terms like saying a pot.
Mm-hmm.
If you got too much water retention,
Yes.
you talked about how. I always thought that was good to keep the water in there for the rest
Well,
of the...
it would be in really dry conditions perhaps, but you have to have a balance of water retention and drainage. And so to get drainage in a condition like that, you have to put in an aerator. The aerator has to be a material that itself does not hold water, and ideally is of irregular shape or surface so that it creates air pockets around it.
So the water's keeping out the air, the oxygen from the...
Right. That's true, I forgot to say that. Yeah, it keeps the oxygen out, so if you put these materials in here that spread out and separate the peat moss, and they themselves don't soak up the water, and they're creating these little pore spaces, you get better drainage. And if you put enough of it in there, you probably offset whatever excessive water retention the peat moss gives you. So it sounded in theory like what we wanted, but the theory was probably based on the dry peat moss that you would then wet, not the stuff that comes directly out of the bog that is super saturated. And the peat moss has, the cells in the peat moss fibers has this incredible capability of holding moisture, and that's partly what makes it such a great material to work with otherwise.
Is peat moss like kelp, where it has different beneficial hormones and other nutrients in it that we might not even know about?
Likely not. In other words, unless there's something in the water that you know that the bog happens to be in, it has practically no nutritional value. Its chief value is in, you might say, lightening, loosening soils and in holding moisture and holding nutrients. It might have a really high cation exchange capacity because it's been down there on the bottom of that bog for thousands of years. And in the process of being in the water all of that time and also decomposing under anaerobic conditions, everything that's of nutrient value has been lost out of it. Where did it go? I don't know, but the peat moss itself has very negligible nutrient content. So in that way it's extremely unlike kelp, because kelp is a living thing in the ocean, and the ocean is full of minerals, and the kelp is, you know, practically like it's transparent or translucent. It's just being bathed in this stuff and taking it up, and it gets such great feeding right directly out of the ocean water that it doesn't have to have roots. What it has instead is a hold fast. It has something that will grab onto a rock to keep it from floating away. But it doesn't need roots because it takes its mineral nutrition right through its I'd say its skin, through its whole body. It takes it up. And then if it's floating near the surface, it's getting enough sunlight so that it's also got the photosynthetic activity going on as well. And as we discussed earlier, photosynthesis is a lot more than simply combining carbon dioxide and water and converting it into sugars. Extremely complex. We'll probably never be able to duplicate it, and there's a whole bunch of steps in there that involve tiny amounts of minerals, without which it just plain would not work.
Now, when applying any of these different minerals or nutrients to a large piece of ground, what's the best way to apply it, and how do you figure out parts per million and per acre and per foot and all that kind of good stuff?
Well, it's not real easy. In other words, if you do a soil test and it says for this plot of ground you're going to need 5 tons of lime, right?
Yeah.
It's going to be up to you to figure out how do you get that 5 tons evenly applied. One way you can kind of maybe make it work is you take half of it and you do your best to get over the whole, let's say the whole acre with that half, and then get it thinly spread on. If you don't quite make it, then you know with the other half you got to compensate in some way. So if you went this way with half of it, then you go this way with the other half, right? And you fill in the holes where you need to bring it up, and then you try to get the rest of it on as evenly as you can. There may be lime applicators with calibrated settings and all of that I'm not familiar with. But by and large, you're probably just going to be on your own to figure out how do you get that evenly spread. And then if it's a pasture, of course, it's going on the top, which is not ideal because the lime really ideally needs to get down into the soil, but eventually it will get worked down there. So if you're putting it on a prepared garden site that's been tilled, you can kind of see as you spread it, because it's white and the ground's going to be black, you can kind of see how it's covering the ground, and it'll go on fairly light. It'll look like a real light snow, I suppose, when it's on about the right amount. And then you till it in, tiller depth, shovel depth, just as a practical matter. You're shooting for 6 to 8 inches, and that's about what it does. There's a thing called plow depth. Maybe there's another term, and it works out to be 7.5 inches, or 6.5 inches, I guess it is. And that's because of the way the plow was designed, and that's how deep it goes. That's been the zone of fertilization, and that's really where it belongs primarily.
What about bacteria and the mycorrhiza? Does that go on top? Does it go inside? Where do we put that?
If you're making a complete mix, I just put it in a complete mix, which is what we do.
Okay.
You know, figure out what the proportion needs to be and mix it in there, because otherwise, unless you're going to dilute it and spray it on, it becomes impractical to take such a tiny quantity of stuff and spread it around to the whole area it has to go over. But if you put it in a filler, whether it's an inert thing or it's the rest of the fertilizer, then you've got evenly dispersed, and it's going to be easy to apply along with the rest of the stuff.
Now, that's always been a dilemma with me, because I have, well, kind of raised beds. You
Mhm.
know, every year I fluff them up, and
Mhm.
every year they
Yeah.
sink down. And some of them are circles, and some of them are crescent shapes, and depending upon the lay of the land and the trees that are there. And so I don't have an area that is 10 feet long and 10 feet wide.
Well,
There's
that's the
not a-
penalty for being artistic.
I know, it's real burden, isn't it? So what I've done is tried to figure out, when they say row length or 100 square feet, is to do the math on it and get it down to per square foot. And then so much, to do all the calibration. Since I cook too, I can get it down to like 1 tablespoon per square foot, and then guesstimate the best you can, I guess. So it's,
It helps to do a plan of your garden and make it accurate to scale. You know, draw your
Yeah, it
beds
does
in,
help.
and then you can kind of calculate what's each bed and what's the overall requirement.
Is there a way in relationship to earthworms breaking up subsoil to encourage population of earthworms to increase?
Well, the key is food. You know, other things need to be right, temperature and moisture, I suppose. But out in nature, most of that's going to be reasonably right. And the key to a population expansion is in the correct feeding. Like where did I put it? This kind of thing. Manure piles for the manure worm, they just find their way into it and will multiply. But again, it's going to depend on the manure. What's the ratio of manure to hay or straw or wood or whatever? What's the state of decay? You know, because they want to eat something that's not totally fresh, but not something that's totally rotten. And over time, the microbes are going to rot it down to the point where the worm can't get any nutrition out of it, because he's looking for this nutrition in that form. So, you know, just doing what Barrett advocates, putting the feed out there is going to attract the worms and create the population explosion. And as long as the conditions remain good and they've got food, theoretically, if you keep feeding them, it won't be very long before they cover the entire earth and all the oceans too. But you'd have trouble staying up with them.
How fast do they multiply?
I don't have the figures in mind, but they have these little egg casings, which actually have only a couple of eggs usually, but may have several eggs in them, and it's in the books how many eggs they'll lay over a certain period, and how long it takes for those eggs to hatch, and how long it takes for the worms to reach maturity, and so forth. And I don't remember the figures, but like I was saying, feed them well, give them a little bit of time, and they'll totally cover the earth. And they have that capacity to do it in relatively short time, but something always goes wrong. Thankfully, we're not swimming in them. If there's no more questions then, I thought I'd talk about some tips having to do with weeding, watering, and pest control. And I'm going to skip on the harvest end of it. We talked about, in relation to pest control, the concept of nutritional pest control. In other words, if we give the plant everything it needs, make it really healthy and robust, you have two consequences, one of which is that the plant is internally resistant, right? It has its own internal protection and resistance. Secondly, because of the way this planet was set up, the pests see it as an unattractive food source because they've been sent out to take down, eat, process, and recycle those things that are unfit and sick. So if you get the health of your plant up, the insects, for instance, don't really recognize it as food, and they would prefer to eat something that's sick and dying, or the diseases aren't able to attack because of the internal enzymes that the plant has developed, and perhaps extra strong external tissue that is resistant to penetration. But the combination of all of that is that you greatly reduce the chances of damage or loss of crop when you get the soil in complete correct fertility and condition, and the plants are responding to that. Okay? So that's the basic principle, and that's the difference between doing things more or less naturally and having to suit up and put on special galoshes and step in some kind of a chemical to get into your greenhouse, so you aren't going to be bringing any germs in, right? So that's a completely different paradigm and a completely different world view of how all of this works. There are various common pest problems, slugs, cutworms, what have you, that you will need to take different and additional steps for. For instance, cutworms, root maggots, and so forth. Give me a second here. One of the solutions is the remay fabric, which has a life expectancy of, at best, about 3 years. You're probably all familiar with it. It's a material that lets light through, lets air through, but excludes insects, provided you seal it around the edges. You can simply lay it over the crop, and the crop will push it up. You can water through it. You may need to take it off for a period if you need insects to get inside to pollinate things. It is somewhat expensive, and so to save it, you want to leave it out in the exposed to light and dirt and so forth as little time as you can. In other words, get it back in and put it in something so that it's protected from light and kept clean, and you'll probably get about 3 years of life out of it. That works pretty well. There are, with respect to, like, say, the root maggot, there are baits that you can make, and it's discussed pretty thoroughly in the Territorial Seed Catalog. There's a bait you make with wheat germ and with the Bacillus thuringiensis organism, and I've forgotten what else, possibly molasses. but it tells how to do that in the section, I think, with broccoli there. As far as slugs go, a real practical thing to do is the Sluggo. Otherwise, another brand is Worry Free. It's a essentially natural bait. The active ingredient is an iron phosphate. What else might be in there, I don't know. Undoubtedly something in there like wheat or whatever that attracts the slug. They can smell it. And there's things like beer traps, which are okay if you've got a lot of beer, if you monitor them, and you put out plenty of them. But probably that Sluggo is the best answer. It won't get them all. The smaller ones seem somehow to get missed or aren't attracted to it as much. Then you have animals, mammals, deer for instance. And if you can do it, it's a really good idea to count on the fact that the deer are coming. They're going to be there in almost all cases. And an easy way to do that is if you have a plot, let's say it's this represents your garden plot. The thing to do is get a bunch of these green posts that you drive into the ground. They're about 5-6 feet tall. You drive them in a foot or so into the ground, and you space them about every 8 feet, okay? Then you get some 8-foot bamboo, and you lash the bamboo with wire or something to the post, all right? So that the bamboo is not quite touching the ground, and runs it on up 8 feet, because you need about 8 feet of height to put up a deer netting, such as here. This product here. This is 100 feet long and 7 feet wide, and it's a nylon mesh. Sells for $25. So if you lash this, these bamboo canes onto the metal post, this makes it something practical. You don't have to stand up on a ladder, what have you. You don't have to buy a really tall post. The bamboo lasts a long time, relatively inexpensive. It's a real simple, inexpensive way of extending the height of the post, like I said, without having to climb a ladder, right? So then you attach this thing to it and go all the way around, and then leave some kind of an opening, obviously, so you can get in and out. One way to do that is run one side of it outside the other, so that it runs past the end like this, and the deer will be confronting it usually from this direction and not find the opening and go around the maze. So you attach the netting to the bamboo and to the metal posts, probably about 6 inches off the ground, because this is only 7 feet wide. So you're going to get it up there about 7.5 feet, which will probably stop most of them, provided they see it. And so what you can do to help them see it is tie little strips of white cloth onto the bamboo and maybe in between, so that it draws their attention and they can see there's something there. Another way to do it is build 2 fences about 4 or 5 feet high, 4 or 5 feet apart, and you maybe could run ducks in there. But the deer won't jump that if they see both fences, because they need more area to land into, and they can't clear the whole thing. And most of them are smart enough to figure out they don't want to do this. What are some of the other pests, common pests?
Moles.
Moles, okay. The most effective thing with moles, unfortunately, is to trap them. The notion that you're going to put something, well, you can kill them by putting exhausts or various kinds of fumes down in the hole.
Oh, they have super highways under
Yeah,
there. They go for acres.
it can be done, but the most efficient sure way to do it is trapping them with a scissor mole trap. And I can show, or I have in the past shown people how to do that. I have pretty good success with it. It's a shame to have to eradicate the mole, but if you don't, you know, a few of them will turn your garden into a battlefield. And that works pretty effectively. It's more difficult where the soil is loose in the garden, and I won't go into the details, but basically I go to the mound, I push the soil aside, I dig a square hole, find the tunnel. Hopefully the tunnel is running through one side and going out the other. Set my trap in there, put a 2-pound coffee can over it, put a little pebble on the can, and watch the pebble. And if after 2 or 3 days the pebble hasn't moved, I figure the mole's somewhere else. If the pebble has moved, the trap has gone off. Half of the time I pull the trap out, there's a mole in it. I just release the prongs, drop the mole back in the hole, push the soil in, put the sod back, and go to the next one. So it doesn't take very many of them to make a big mess, and usually there's not very many of them there if you get on it quick.
So, for about 4 years now, I've had real good luck. I do like you, I scrape the mound off,
Mm-hmm.
and I take a quarter cup of apple cider vinegar
Mm-hmm.
and pour in the mound, and it finds the hole down there.
Mhm.
And I can drive them, I only have half an acre, but I can drive them off the half acre.
With apple cider vinegar?
Apple cider vinegar, and I have to do it, if it rains really hard, I have to reapply it. But I usually only have to do it maybe 3 times in the summer
That's news
season.
to me. You know,
I learned that because my neighbor was using gas, and I thought I can't just have him pouring gas in the
That's-
ground. I got to find something else for him
That's
to use.
breaking news. That's on the par of a nuclear meltdown.
Yeah, and apple cider vinegar works the best. The white vinegar in that doesn't work as well.
Look right
Something about
behind you
that,
there on the
so-
floor. You see that square bucket?
Yep.
Just got that in. That's apple cider vinegar. So I have a source of apple cider vinegar by the 4-gallon bucket size.
It's
How
easy to
much?
make too.
Hmm?
You can
Well,
make it too.
Okay. She's one of those do-it-yourself,
Yeah, I'm one of
self-sufficient,
those stubborn ones.
homesteader types, save a buck, and nothing's wrong with that. But yeah, I guess if you're into it, make it yourself.
One time what was that store, and they had these stakes with a photoelectric cell on top
Mhm.
together,
Yep.
and they vibrate every once
Yep.
in a while. And they were closing them out, so I
Yeah.
bought a couple, and they
Yeah.
seemed to really work pretty
Was
well.
that right?
Yeah, for as long as the stakes lasted.
The thing that makes me wonder about stuff like that is, does the mole know how far away it needs to go before it's off of your property? Does the mole know where your property line is?
Well, they only work for a certain
Yeah.
radius.
Right. And so things like that may well work. I'm not saying that they don't, but I'm wondering if they really do the job all that well.
Well, I don't know if it gets rid of the moles, but it gets rid of the mounds.
Yeah,
And
when
they
you go out,
don't eat all my beets, and
you go out and level the mounds and you put this stuff down there and they find that undesirable and they leave. Yeah,
How much did you say you're putting down there?
about a quarter cup.
that's not very much at all.
No.
Then do you cover it back in?
No.
Leave it open?
Just find out where the tunnel
just
is.
scrape it off, and usually you can see
You'll
where
see a
it's
little
at. If you
dimple
can,
there.
once you pour the vinegar on there, it finds that
Yeah.
loose spot in the soil and runs down through.
Yeah.
So.
How much is that 4-gallon?
Yeah, the poor mole is out there helping make soil, and guess what it's eating? I think we talked
Worms.
about that. Its main diet is earthworms. So if you make too many worms, you might get lots of moles. I don't know. It's a dilemma. Everything is a dilemma.
They're
What about
industrious.
What about nutria?
Nutria. Nutria is a foreign animal from South America that's spread into this area. It's more of a farmer's problem than a gardener's problem, although gardeners might have it. I can't say that I know the best way of getting rid of them. Probably trapping. Or the 22. Go out at dusk and shoot them.
Oh, yeah, which brings us to rabbits.
Yeah, rabbits are not real numerous in this particular region. Um, There are, oh, and I forgot to mention for deer, there are some effective repellents. We sell 2 of them here that may work for rabbits. They're advertised as working for rabbits. One of them is called plant skeed, which is in which is a form of a blood meal actually. It also comes in a pelleted form. May work on rabbits. It is said to work on voles, and I have a customer who tells me it does indeed. You spread it where the moles run around and they'll leave. But it works well on deer, partly by odor, maybe by taste. There are people who swear by it. And then there's the other product, which is liquid fence, which is a rotten egg and forgotten, maybe vinegar concoction. And that works quite well, I think mainly by taste. I've used it on trees that deer were eating. By the time they come back for a second bite, that's as far as it gets. They don't come back as long as it's there and effective. Both of those products work reasonably well through rains, but eventually will wash away. And they're both effective against deer and elk. Okay, pest control.
Rabbits, do you have?
Oh, rabbits! Well, that product might work on rabbits. The best thing to do with rabbits is you make this fence, okay? The first rung up is something like hog wire, right? But, but down at the bottom, you get some galvanized chicken wire, okay? So you run it up maybe a couple of foot up the fence and down into the ground about a foot, and then curve it back 6 inches or so. So if you buy a 3-foot wide section of galvanized chicken wire, and you just dig a little trench, put it down there, and curve it on the bottom, L shape, the rabbit will come up to the fence. If he's inclined to dig, he digs down and he runs into wire, and that can really frustrate you. You're trying to get through wire. So that will work.
Yeah, we've
They
done all
don't-
that now.
And it did not work.
Well, it's now the wire's been there long enough, and so you can't clear brush away from around the wire either.
Yeah.
Is it now the brush is growing up through it, and then which, you know, is more, and then they can climb it and get up and through it. So it's just constant.
You need a goat.
Watch 'em. A goat? Yeah.
Eat the brush.
Yeah. Had a goat for a while.
For a dog to,
So
No,
then-
hell for a while.
Weeds and watering. Let's talk about watering. With most gardens, when it's not raining, you want to apply an inch of water a week. You get into the hot season, then maybe double that. And you can do that by setting out a little container and, you know, it's maybe an inch deep or whatever. When you see that it's an inch full, you can stop. It's best to apply water to the ground rather than onto the plant, and because you want it to soak into the ground. It's best to put it on before the day gets hot, so that it soaks in, and the plant and the roots are getting all the water they need going into the evening, and it's not evaporating as you apply it. So apply it to the ground where you can. The other thing you can do is mulching. Once the plants are up, you put down maybe a 6-inch mulch around, let's say, your vegetables, and that will retard evaporation and also likely prevent a lot of weed growth. Now, the surprising thing about it is that if you leave the ground bare, you can lose a lot from evaporation, but evaporation in an intensely planted garden is actually much less than evapotranspiration, which is the water that moves through the plant. Why it does this, I don't know, but it moves water up through and passes out into the atmosphere.
what do you call it?
Evapotranspiration. And it's in hot weather, it's much more, what's the word? The rate of water loss is much greater through the plant than off of the soil. This is something you don't realize. Yes.
Probably a cooling process.
Yeah. What is the answer? Maybe you're right. Maybe that's what it is. Well, the plant has to maintain rigidity, and you think, the reason it's doing that is that it's taking nutrients and sucking them up and moving them up into the plant. But that turns out not to be the case. And, even when that's going on full bore, nutrients have been measured going the opposite direction, leaving the plant. So it's not a matter or a means of moving nutrients out of the soil up into the plant through evapotranspiration. It's doing it for some other reason.
The trees in California, when it gets really hot, can actually explode because there's so much pressure going through them.
Never knew that.
Yeah, limbs will just.
So, if you want to, and you've got enough room, part of the way of countering excessive loss of moisture, if you want to look at it that way, is to space your plants further apart. And this is the argument that Steve Solomon makes in a couple of his books, including the one about hard times. But you'd have to have a fairly large amount of area. But likely you'll get a larger plant too. If you're trying to grow a cabbage, instead of a soccer ball size, you're going to get a basketball size. And maybe overall it comes out the same, I don't know.
What do you mulch with usually?
Well, ideally a combination of things. Usually what's available is leaves and grass clippings. Or you could buy clean straw, ideally somewhat chopped up. You could use pine needles, fir needles. A combination of those things is going to tend not to mat and get slimy. It's going to let air in because it's separating all the different things. And yet it's not going to be deep enough that you're going to set up what amounts to a hot composting situation. So just a mixture of organic materials by and large that hopefully is weed free. And before you put it on, you should do your weeding, get as many of them as you can out of there. And when you put it on, if you block the sunlight and you're only dealing with seeds, anything over a couple of inches, if it's fairly dense, it's going to block the sunlight so that it doesn't penetrate the soil and stimulate the seed to germinate. So as far as weeding goes, one of the things you can do, well, the main philosophy is get in early and often. It's like in Chicago, vote early and vote often, but you go in there and you weed when things are small, easy to knock them down, right? Real easy with a hose, skim them off. And the more you do that, the more you'll be rewarded with a lot less trouble and toil as the season goes on. And if you do that, wet the ground, then put your mulch down, likely you're going to get 90% of them or better under control. You won't get those weeds. I had another thought there. But, the other thing you can do is when you're first preparing the garden, if it's a vegetable garden in the early part of the year and the rains are infrequent enough to permit you to do it, you go in when you get a dry spell, you till the garden and probably work in your fertilizer and your lime, and then you let it sit for a while. Because what you have done is you've taken seeds that are down fairly deep and you've brought a lot of them up closer to the surface. When they're fairly close to the surface and they can detect sunlight, then they've got the right conditions, and that's when they germinate. Okay, so if you till your fertilizers down, let the thing sit for a while, after a few days, maybe a week, they start sprouting, okay? Then you run through real shallowly with your tiller, the top inch, kill all of those. And so you got them out of the way, you might get 75% of the weeds you would otherwise get just doing that. Just let them sprout, and then go through with a tiller or a hoe and shave that off, and you probably killed, 75% of them. And if you don't disturb the soil much, there's not enough light getting down in there to set off the next wave of them. And then if you mulch, you've done double duty there. So a combination of those things likely will reduce your weeding problem to very minimal.
I've had some success with weeding with compost, or mulching with compost too, especially around carrots and after the moles have gone through.
Yeah, but do you weed before you put it down?
Oh yeah.
Yeah. So you want to put it down after the crop is up sufficiently high that the leaves can still get sunlight and photosynthesize.
And not as much with the compost too, because you don't want to bury it.
Right. So remember now, the roots like it cool and the leaves like it warm. And the roots are incapable of photosynthesizing. So you don't want to expose the roots and you don't want to bury the leaves when you mulch. Okay, we did a little bit on watering, a little bit on weeding, and my golly, look, it's almost noon.
We're going to bring in some pepper plants.
Oh, pepper plants. Hey, Sean, would you go out and get a flat of the pepper plants to show these people?
Yes.
Thank you. All right. Yes, sir.
So, I'm wondering if I'm getting the wrong message from the big picture in general. Is you're saying if you have the right balance of everything, you should never have to add nitrogen, period?
That's what I'm saying. And best I can figure out.
That's the whole issue with
Yeah,
industrial farming. They're adding nitrogen every year.
right.
Year after
And
year.
it gets more and more expensive. It gets harder and harder, probably to source. And that's one of the things that's going to bring conventional agriculture to a halt. It's petroleum dependent. And it's also a matter of taking nitrogen out of the atmosphere and converting it into ammonia or whatever it is they do. It's real expensive, energy intensive in order to do that. So nitrogen is the most expensive single nutrient to buy. And the conventional attitude is that's what you gotta have, the more the better, and that's what's indispensable. Well, ecological agriculture says, no, not so at all. Put everything else in there, get it balanced. The nitrogen fixing organisms that work at less than minimum wage will make it for you. Out of the abundance of atmospheric nitrogen, at least the part that's in the soil, they will make your nitrogen for you, but you got to get everything else in reasonably close balance for them to do that. As best I can make out of it, that's how it works. So that's the Albrecht philosophy. That's the philosophy behind the Logan Lab. Why they don't give you, there they are.
Yay.
Why they don't give you a nitrogen number, one of the reasons. Thanks, Sean. Thanks. Did you water them this morning?
I'm watering right now. Okay. Right now's watering.
All right.
We don't have the heat now, so they didn't dry out as much.
Now, are these for your experimental
Yes,
soil
these
trials?
are guinea pigs.
Okay.
Yeah.
Will you be having them on display later on so we can
Let's
see
see how
what?
they
Yeah, well,
I wanna see what the
next week we
different-
can take another look at them.
different soils are.
Yes.
That soil you're having brought in, made,
Yeah.
and so forth, will it be possible to go out there and
Yes.
have them take a loader and just?
Yep.
Okay.
Yep, load up and pick up.
Yeah.
That's, you'll need to make an appointment. And I'm presently trying to do up a flyer that I can hand to people that tells them roughly where it is, phone number, what's in the stuff, how much it costs, but I don't have it ready.
And when will that be available?
He's supposed to be making it as we speak. Today, he's been waiting for some decent weather. So it's not gonna be, it's gonna have some rocks in it, it's not gonna be as nice, in overall consistency as our potting mix, because we're gonna screen these things here as a preliminary step to making the potting mix. We're gonna get the worst of the rocks out. It's pretty hard to find topsoil that doesn't have some kind of a problem. If not weed seeds, then it's rocks. If it's not that, it's glass and nail. So,
I had a question on pruning.
yeah.
Is there anything, any specific advice you have for pruning plants as well as trees?
Vegetable plants, my advice, don't. Don't
Oh,
bother.
even tomatoes?
Don't bother.
Mm.
Cage them. Because if you have nothing better to do with your time, you can prune them and train them and you'll get very large tomatoes. But if you harvest them all and weigh them, overall weight will be no more than if you didn't prune them.
Mm.
Assuming the weather's decent.
And trees?
Trees, it depends on the tree. Apple trees in particular, they do require pruning in part for ease of access and aesthetics, and also probably for just health. You got to recognize that anytime you cultivate something and change it or breed it, you're usually going to invite some kind of trouble, and that's the case with the apple tree. It maybe was meant to grow without need of any kind of pruning, but if you don't prune it, you eventually wind up with a jungle. And so the thing to do before you prune is look at the tree and look at what structure it has and the structure that you want, and then go in there and start taking out the dead stuff, the limbs that are getting into one another's way, anything you need to take off because you're going to knock your head on it or whatever. And so you're trying to get that basic framework. Then you go in and you start taking off some of last year's growth to keep the thing from continually going, sprawling and so forth. So you take off a fourth to a third of last year's growth, and usually you can see it. It's like if on your finger, last year it was here, you can see where it's calloused over and the new growth will be shinier. So this part here, you're going to take off a fourth to a third of it each year. And you try to cut just above a bud without damaging the bud, and ideally that bud needs to be on facing outward. The growth will tend to go in the direction that the bud is facing. And so you go through and you take that out, and then I guess you go back and look at it and see what you missed.
And if you have one that hasn't been trimmed in like 20 years?
Well, if it's, is it an apple tree?
Yeah, we just got a farm that's got like 18 trees or something like that, and they're all, none of them have been messed with for probably at least 20 years.
Yeah, you may find that trying to do it just right is far more labor than you want to do. There may be shortcuts to it, you know, taking a chainsaw to some of it, but the thing about an apple tree is that it's really hard to kill. It'll live for a long time, as long as the soil conditions are good and you don't get a storm like we did a couple of years ago. And so you can revive almost anything, you know, that happens to an apple tree. You can bring it back to good form, bring it back to good shape and growth, and if you feed it, fertile mulching, something like that, yeah, in a matter of a couple of years probably you can have it back to really good shape, good production, high quality fruit.
I suggest Pruning Simplified, the book, and you might be able to find it in the library, but that's the name of it, Pruning Simplified, and it covers everything. Blueberries, apples, evergreens, the blackberries, whatever, and it's very, with diagrams, and it's very straightforward, it's a great book.
Which makes me think that I should have made up a bibliography on references.
If you have some,
That's
your favorites or
skipped my
something.
mind, yeah.
Great. But so often we see, pruning over the years, and it aggravates the hell out of me to go around town and see people take their chainsaws to like apple trees and just cut the tops off of them completely.
Yeah.
Or the maple trees. They go in and they cut all of their limbs off and the tops off, and but trees want to grow to the sky.
And chances are they're not getting any apples.
Yeah.
And it's gonna take them 10 more years to figure that out.
Yeah. You can't, cut your arms off and then expect them to do something.
Any more questions? I'm happy to stick around for people that want to talk, but otherwise, the promise was to let you out of here tonight.
Thank you.
Sure.
Right.
Thank you.
Wonderful.
Hello, question.
Yeah.
Control section under that bird worm casting. You said, and I didn't know it was 10%. Oh, 10% of the waste mix with fertilizer, 10% of fertilizer with worm castings, or
10% of the soil mix is worm castings. You can get good bang out of it with only 10% worm castings mixed into your garden soil.
Thank you for watching. See you later, YouTube. Bye, Diego.